She had always understood the language of broken things. Not the dramatic kind of brokenness. Not the shattered windows and slammed doors of a household in open war, but the quiet kind. The hairline crack in a porcelain cup that no one mentions because mentioning it would require acknowledging that something precious has been damaged. The fraying edge of a tapestry that everyone pretends not to see. The silence at a dinner table where conversation used to live. Miss Violet Ashcroft, 24 years old, the second daughter of a man whose fortune had been considerable and whose debts were considerably more, had spent the better part of her life learning to read those silences. She had also spent it learning something rarer and more particular. The art of repair. Not metaphorical repair. Actual repair. The kind that required steady hands, a magnifying glass, and a patience so deep it bordered on devotion. Her workshop, if one could call it that, occupied a small room at the back of the Ashcroft townhouse in Bloomsbury, London, where the morning light came in at exactly the right angle and the smell of fine adhesive and linseed oil had long since soaked into the walls. It was here that Violet spent her mornings before the household woke, and her evenings after it had retired, restoring the things that other people had given up on. Ceramic figures with missing limbs. Lacquered boxes with split seams. Once, memorably, a 17th-century enamel miniature that had been dropped from a second-story window and arrived in 17 pieces in a leather pouch, accompanied by a note that read simply, "Please. It is the only thing I have left of her." That miniature had taken Violet 3 weeks. She had worked by candlelight and magnifying glass, had mixed pigments until her fingers were permanently stained, had laid each fragment with the precision of a surgeon and the tenderness of a confessor. When she returned it, whole, the join lines nearly invisible, the painted face of a young woman with dark eyes serene and undamaged. The woman who had sent it had wept. Violet had not mentioned the fee. This was, in many ways, the problem. The morning the letter arrived was an unremarkable Tuesday in March, the kind of London morning that could not decide between rain and resignation and had settled on both. Violet was at her workbench, carefully reconstructing the lid of a Meissen snuff-box for a Mr. Cavendish of Grosvenor Square, when she heard the post arrive. She did not go immediately. She had learned that letters, like bad news, had a way of finding you regardless of how quickly you moved toward them. She found it on the hall table when she went for her second cup of tea. A letter bearing a seal she did not recognize. Dark red wax, pressed with an impression that showed a falcon mid-stoop, wings folded, talons extended. Precise, uncompromising, the kind of seal that did not ask permission. She turned it over. The direction was written in a hand she did not know. Bold, angular, slanted slightly to the right, the letters of someone who wrote quickly and expected to be obeyed. Miss Violet Ashcroft. To be delivered by hand. Urgent. She broke the seal. The letter was brief, no preamble, no pleasantry, no softening of any kind. It read, "Miss Ashcroft, your name has been given to me by Mr. Cavendish of Grosvenor Square, who informs me that you possess an unusual and reliable skill in the restoration of antique objects of value. I need precisely that skill in a matter of some delicacy. You will present yourself at Aldenmere House, Mayfair, on Thursday the 16th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Ask for Mr. Prescott, who will explain the nature of the commission. I trust punctuality will not be an inconvenience. Aldenmere. No first name. No title written out in full. Just the single word, the name of a dukedom that Violet, even in her limited engagement with the social world, recognized immediately. The Duke of Aldenmere. She set the letter down on the hall table. She picked it up again. She read it a second time, not because the words had changed, but because she needed to confirm that what she was reading was what she thought she was reading. The Duke of Aldenmere was not a man one ignored. He was also not a man one expected to write to a restorer in Bloomsbury. He was the sort of figure who existed at the outer edge of Violet's awareness. A name mentioned in newspapers in connection with Parliament, with large estates in 3 counties, with a reputation for ruthlessness in business and an almost aggressive indifference to the social season that other men of his rank pursued with such exhausting dedication. He did not, by all accounts, invite people to Aldenmere House. Violet tucked the letter into the pocket of her work apron and returned to the Meissen snuff-box. She would go, of course. The question was never whether she would go. The question was what she would find when she got there, and whether she was equipped to handle it. The Ashcroft household woke slowly, as it always did, with the particular heavy quality of a family that had been quietly unraveling for years and had not yet agreed on whether to acknowledge it. Her father, Sir Edmund Ashcroft, appeared at breakfast in his dressing gown, which was unusual even by his current standards. He had the look of a man who had slept badly and was not prepared to pretend otherwise. He poured his tea, unfolded the morning paper, and retreated behind it without a word. Her mother, Lady Constance, sat at the opposite end of the table with the rigid posture of a woman determined to maintain appearances even in a room containing only her immediate family and a footman who had heard everything worth hearing years ago. She was reading a letter from Violet's elder sister, Genevieve, who had married a baronet in Shropshire 2 years ago and whose letters, Violet had noticed, contained less and less of Genevieve and more of the baronet's opinions, as though marriage were a gradual process of replacement. There was no place set for correspondence intended for Violet. She sat between her parents in the customary middle position, the one that was neither head nor foot of anything, that belonged to no particular role or expectation, and ate her toast and thought about the Duke of Aldenmuir's letter. "You have paint on your hands again," her mother said, without looking up from Genevieve's letter. "I was working this morning." "You are always working. It is not attractive, Violet." "It pays the household accounts for October," Violet said mildly. A silence. Her father turned a page of his newspaper with the focused attention of a man choosing not to have heard something. Her mother's expression flickered. Not gratitude, something cooler, the recognition of a fact that was inconvenient because it was true. "Genevieve asks after you," Lady Constance said, redirecting. "She wonders when you intend to come to Shropshire for the summer. I am not sure I can be away from commissions for the length of a summer visit." "Commissions." Her mother repeated the word with the particular inflection that transformed a neutral noun into a mild accusation. "You make it sound like a profession." "It is a profession, Mother." Lady Constance set down Genevieve's letter with the careful precision that Violet recognized as the prelude to a conversation she did not want to have. "It is a temporary arrangement," she said, "until the appropriate circumstances present themselves. Your father and I have discussed." "You have discussed," Sir Edmund said from behind his newspaper, with the brevity of a man who had long since stopped engaging with discussions that involved him in name only. Violet finished her toast. She thought about Thursday. She thought about the letter in her apron pocket, and the seal of a falcon midstoop, and the single authoritative word, Aldenmuir. She did not mention it at breakfast. Aldenmuir House on a Thursday afternoon in March was not what Violet had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. Perhaps something colder, something more fortress-like. The house was a Palladian townhouse on the better end of Mayfair, its facade pale stone and symmetrical windows, its iron railings painted a glossy black that caught the watery afternoon sun and held it. There were no flowers outside. There was no softness of any kind. But the house was not aggressive, not quite. It was simply impeccably composed, the architectural equivalent of a face arranged to reveal nothing. She was admitted by a butler who regarded her work bag, the one she always carried, with its small tools and her magnifying glass, with an expression of mild confusion before recovering himself. She was shown to a sitting room furnished with the precision of a space no one actually sat in, and left to wait. Mr. Prescott arrived within 5 minutes. He was a small, neat man of middle age, with the air of someone who had been efficiently managing other people's complications for so long that he had achieved a kind of personal frictionlessness. He carried a leather folder and wore the expression of a man who was about to explain something difficult and had already prepared for the most likely objections. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, shaking her hand with brisk firmness. "Thank you for coming. I'll be direct, as I believe His Grace would prefer. There is an object. It has been damaged. His Grace requires it restored. The nature of the object is somewhat sensitive." Violet opened her bag and withdrew her notebook. "Go on." Prescott placed his leather folder on the table between them and opened it. Inside was a photograph, a formal studio photograph of the kind that required long exposure and rigid stillness, showing a crown. Not a royal crown. Not the kind that lived in towers behind iron gates. This was smaller, more personal, made for a head, not a throne. It was constructed, as best Violet could tell from the photograph, from gold filigree worked into an intricate pattern of interlocking leaves and vines, set at intervals with what appeared to be pearls and a single larger stone at the center. A diamond, perhaps, or a white sapphire. The workmanship was extraordinary, the kind that had not been done by English craftsmen in 2 centuries or more. The Aldenmuir wedding crown, Prescott said. The family has possessed it for approximately 230 years. It has been worn by the bride at every Aldenmuir ducal wedding, since the 3rd Duke brought it back from Florence in 1691. It is, by any reasonable assessment, irreplaceable. Violet studied the photograph. What happened to it? Prescott's expression underwent a subtle but perceptible shift. It was dropped, he said, with the careful neutrality of someone omitting significant context. By whom? That is not relevant to the commission. Violet looked at him steadily. The manner of the damage is always relevant to the commission, Mr. Prescott. Whether the break was a sudden impact, gradual stress fracture, or something else entirely determines the method of repair. I will need to know. A pause. Prescott adjusted the folder. It was dropped, he said again. During an incident 3 weeks ago, the crown fell from approximately 4 feet and struck a marble floor. Several of the filigree branches are broken. One of the primary settings has been dislodged, and the center stone is missing. Additionally, 2 of the smaller pearls have been lost. Violet absorbed this. And the pieces, the broken filigree, the dislodged setting, were they recovered? Most of them. They are in a box. May I see the crown itself? Prescott closed his folder. His Grace wishes to meet you first. Violet had not expected this. She kept her expression level. Of course. The study of the Duke of Aldenmuir was a room that told a story. Not a comfortable story, not a performed one, but a real one. The shelves held not decorative volumes but actual books. Red books, their spines creased and their pages marked. The desk was wide and covered in correspondence organized with military precision. On the mantelpiece were 2 small objects. A miniature landscape painting in a plain frame and a fragment of ancient marble. A carved hand, partial. The fingers curled as though closing around something that was no longer there. The Duke stood by the window when Violet entered. She was given approximately 2 seconds to take in her first impression before he turned. He was younger than she had imagined. Not young. There were lines at the corners of his eyes and a settled quality to his bearing that spoke of long experience. But younger than the figure her mind had constructed from newspaper references and drawing-room whispers. He was tall and spare, with dark hair worn somewhat longer than fashion strictly required and a face that was striking rather than handsome. All strong angles and contained energy. The face of a man who thought quickly and said less than he was thinking. His eyes, when they found her, were gray. Not the mild, indefinite gray of an overcast sky but something sharper. The gray of flint, of winter water. He did not offer his hand. He regarded her with the direct attention of someone who had decided that social pretense was a tax he no longer wished to pay. Miss Ashcroft, he said. His voice was measured, precise, carrying the faint residual accent of someone educated far from London. Cavendish tells me you repaired a 16th-century miniature in 17 pieces. I did. How? Violet set down her bag. Carefully. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly, but the acknowledgement that a satisfactory answer had been given. Sit down, he said. She sat. He remained standing, which she noticed, though she did not remark on it. Men who remained standing when they invited others to sit were usually men who preferred the advantage of height, or men who could not yet bring themselves to be still. She suspected, in this case, both were true. The crown, he said. You've seen the photograph. I've seen the photograph. I'd like to see the object. You will. He turned from the window and moved to a small safe set into the wall beside the bookcase. He opened it with a combination she did not observe, and removed a box. Dark wood, fitted brass hinges, the kind of box designed for something of importance. He placed it on the desk and opened it. Violet rose and came to stand across from him. The crown lay on a bed of ivory silk, even damaged, and it was damaged, clearly and significantly, 3 of its delicate filigree branches broken at their stems, a 4th bent at a wrong angle, the central setting sitting askew with its stone absent, 2 small circular depressions where the missing pearls had been. Even in this state, it was the most beautiful piece of metalwork she had ever seen. She did not reach for it immediately. She stood and looked at it, taking in the whole before examining the parts. This was always her first practice with any damaged object. See it whole first, understand what it was meant to be, so that every subsequent decision was made in service of that wholeness. "How old?" she asked. The body of the piece was made in Florence, approximately 1688. Several elements were added or replaced in subsequent generations. The pearls are 18th century additions. The central stone, a white sapphire, was set in 1820. Some of the filigree has been repaired before, I believe, though not within living memory. He knew his crown. She noted this. "May I?" She indicated the box. He nodded. She drew on the thin cotton gloves she always carried and lifted the crown with both hands, slowly, turning it in the light. The breaks were clean, she noted with relief. Not the crumbling disintegration of metal that had fatigued over time, but the sharp fractures of sudden impact. The bent filigree branch had not snapped, which meant it could potentially be worked back without replacement. The missing sapphire concerned her more than the broken branches, as did the absent pearls. "The stone and the pearls," she said. "They were not recovered from the scene?" "The sapphire was not. 2 of the smaller pearls were found. The 3rd is gone." Violet examined the empty central setting, a collet of gold, slightly splayed by the impact, which had allowed the stone to escape. The sapphire would need to be matched. 18th century Florentine pearls would need to be sourced. Neither was impossible. Neither was simple. She looked up and found the Duke watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not impatience. Not the performative interest of a man who wanted to appear engaged while waiting for an answer he had already decided upon. He was watching her the way she watched damaged objects, with the full attention of someone trying to understand something. "Can you repair it?" he asked. "I can restore it," Violet said, making the distinction precisely. A repair is visible. A restoration attempts to return the object as nearly as possible to its original condition. There will be some evidence of the damage. There always is at my level of magnification, but to the naked eye and in use you would not know. "In use," he repeated. Something passed across his face quickly, like a shadow crossing water. "You said it was worn at every Aldenmere wedding." The silence that followed was several seconds longer than the question required. "Yes," he said. Violet placed the crown back into its box with the same deliberate care she had used to lift it. She removed her gloves. "I will need the crown brought to my workshop. I cannot do this kind of work anywhere else. I need my tools, my materials, and my light. I will also need to source a matching sapphire and a matching pearl from a reputable dealer, the cost of which will be additional to my fee. The work will take." She considered the broken branches, the missing stone, the bent element, approximately 3 to 4 weeks, perhaps 5, if the sourcing of the stones presents difficulty. "For weeks," the Duke said. "At the minimum, Your Grace. This is extraordinarily fine work. The original craftsman was a master of a standard that has not existed in Europe for 100 years. I will not rush it." She had said this to impatient clients before and watched them bristle. The Duke did not bristle. He looked at her for a moment with that same careful attention. "What is your usual fee for a commission of this scope?" She named a figure. It was her honest figure, not inflated for the address or the title. She had long since found that inflated figures created inflated expectations, and with work of this delicacy, she preferred her clients to measure her against her actual skill, not her billing. "Double it," he said. Violet blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Double the fee. The crown it matters considerably to this family. I want it done properly, without pressure from the economy, without any incentive to compromise." His gray eyes met hers directly. "Will that be acceptable?" She studied him for a moment. This was not generosity performed for an audience. There was no one in the room but the two of them. He was, she realized, genuinely trying to remove any obstacle between her and the best possible work. "Yes," she said. "That will be acceptable." He nodded. "Prescott will arrange transport of the crown to Bloomsbury tomorrow morning. He will also serve as the point of contact for any questions or requirements that arise during the commission. If a sourcing matter requires authorization, you have it in advance." He moved toward the door in a way that indicated the meeting was concluded. "Your Grace," Violet said. He paused. "The crown. You said it matters considerably to the family." She looked at him steadily, with the directness she had learned was more honest than hedging. "I want you to know that I understand that. I have worked with objects that are the last remaining thing a person has of someone they've lost. I don't treat them as transactions. I treat them as trusts." The Duke stood very still for a moment. Something moved in his gray eyes. Not the flicker of social surprise, but something deeper, something touched. "I know," he said quietly. "That is why Cavendish gave me your name." He left. Violet stood in the study for a moment alone, looking at the wooden box on the desk, and felt the particular quiet weight of a commission that was going to be more than a commission. She had felt it before with the miniature with a handful of others. The moment when the object on her workbench stopped being an object and became a story. The crown arrived the next morning at 8 o'clock, carried by Prescott himself in a locked case, accompanied by a sealed envelope. Inside the envelope was a list in the Duke's precise angular hand. Every known detail of the crown's history, every previous repair noted in the family records, the name of 3 reputable stone dealers he had already contacted on her behalf, and a note at the bottom that read, "If anything further is required, write to Prescott. I am told the sourcing of period Florentine pearls can be difficult. A contact in Venice has been notified. His name and direction are enclosed." Violet stood at her workbench and read the list twice. Then she set it down beside the crown's box and felt something she had not expected to feel, the sensation of being taken seriously. Not thanked, not praised, taken seriously. The way one professional acknowledges another. The way a person who cares about the same thing communicates that they have thought about how to make your work easier, because the work matters more than the gesture. She opened the box. She put on her gloves. She lifted the crown into the morning light. "Right then," she said aloud to herself, as she always did at the beginning of a significant commission, "let's see what you are." The weeks that followed established themselves into a rhythm Violet had not anticipated. Each morning, she rose early and went to her workbench. Each evening, she worked until the light failed. The commission consumed her the way only the best work did. Not oppressively, but with a quality of total absorption that left no room for anything extraneous. She had disassembled the damaged sections of the crown with a precision that would have looked, to an outside observer, very much like surgery. Each broken element was catalogued, its fracture surface examined under magnification, its metallurgical properties noted. The gold was an alloy she had not encountered before, slightly reddish in tone, harder than modern equivalents, the particular signature of a Florentine workshop. She had documented everything in her workbook, which by the end of the first week had grown to 15 pages of notes, sketches, and material analyses. The sapphire had been the first major obstacle. White sapphires of the period were sourced primarily from Ceylon, and finding a match in color, clarity, and cut for an 18th-century stone that had been individually selected by a Florentine craftsman was not a matter of visiting a jeweler's shop. She had written to the 3 dealers on the Duke's list, describing the original setting and the ghost impression left in the gold where the stone had sat for 200 years. The response from the 3rd dealer, a man in Bath with a network of European contacts, had been promising. The pearls were found through the Venice connection. The Duke's Venetian contact, a dealer of antique jewelry whose letter arrived within a week, had in his possession a strand of Florentine Baroque pearls from approximately 1720, a match in luster and dimension close enough that Violet had written back immediately with an offer. The cost was significant. She paid it from the doubled commission without concern. It was during the 2nd week while she was working on the bent filigree branch, a delicate process of warming the gold to workability and then coaxing it, fraction by fraction, back toward its original curve, that Prescott arrived unannounced. This was unusual. Prescott communicated almost exclusively by letter. He was accompanied, she realized as she looked up from her workbench, by someone who was not Prescott's usual accompanying footman. The Duke of Aldenmuir stood in the doorway of her workshop. He looked somewhat different than he had in Mayfair. He wore a plain dark coat, no hat, his hair slightly disordered by the walk from wherever the carriage had set him down. He looked around the workshop with the same careful attention he had given her in his study. The shelves of tools and materials, the ordered rows of commission-in-progress boxes, the particular quality of morning light she had spent 3 months cultivating when she moved the bench, and then his gaze found the crown. "Your Grace," Violet said. She did not stand. She was in the middle of a process that could not be interrupted without risk of error, and she had spent enough of her life deferring physical necessities to social expectation that she had quietly stopped doing it. He did not appear to expect her to stand. He crossed the room. She noted that he moved quietly, without the assertive footfall of men who wished their presence to be felt before they arrived, and stopped at a respectful distance from her workbench. He looked at the crown, which lay in its rest with 3 of its 4 damaged branches now repaired and the bent element partially restored. "The difference is already visible," he said. "It's beginning to look like itself again." Violet agreed. She made one more careful increment of movement with the forming tool, checked the angle against her reference sketch, and set the tool down. "You should have sent word you were coming. I would have had the kettle on." She was not sure why she said it. It was the sort of thing she said to the few clients she had developed an actual working relationship with, the ones who returned, who asked questions, who cared about the process and not just the result. She had not expected it to be appropriate for a duke. He looked at her with a fractional expression that was not quite a smile. "I did not want to interrupt." "You chose well," Violet said. 20 minutes earlier and I would have had to ask you to wait outside." He looked again at the crown. "The bent branch," he said. "It was the worst of the damage." Yes, the impact point was there. The other breaks were secondary, the force radiating outward from the initial contact. This one took the full weight of the fall. She indicated the element with her pencil, not touching. "I was concerned at first that the metal had work-hardened past the point of coaxing, but it's been more cooperative than I expected. Florentine gold of this period has a quality that modern alloys have lost, a certain flexibility in the grain structure. They understood metallurgy better than we give them credit for." She had not intended to say that much. It was the kind of observation she usually kept to her workbook. But the Duke was looking at the crown, not at her, and his attention had the quality she had noticed before. Genuine, not performed. "You enjoy it," he said. It was not a question. "I love it," Violet said, without qualification. "That surprises people sometimes. They expect me to be more reserved about it." "Why would they expect that?" "Because it's trade," Violet said, with the dry matter-of-factness of someone who had heard this observation from every direction and had long since decided to be bored by it rather than offended. "Trade," the Duke repeated, with an inflection she did not entirely understand. Something in it, some faint edge, that was not directed at her. "I gather your Grace disagrees." "I gather," he said, "that the people who say that have never seen a crown repaired." Violet looked up at him. He was still looking at the crown, and in the morning light his face was less composed than it had been in Mayfair, the planes of it more open, the controlled energy she had noticed before present but quieter, like a fire that has found its proper size. "Would you like tea?" she asked. "I was going to stop in a few minutes regardless." He looked at her then, with an expression that seemed briefly startled. Not by the invitation itself, she thought, but by its ordinariness, its complete absence of ceremony. As though the offer of tea in a Bloomsbury workshop were something for which his experience had not quite prepared him. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She made the tea herself, since her assistant Mrs. Colebrook did not come until 11, and they drank it at the small table in the corner of the workshop that she used for client consultations. He sat across from her with the cup held in both hands in a way that was less about warmth than about occupation. She thought, the habit of a man who needed something to do with his hands when he was not doing something with his hands. "May I ask," she said, "how the crown came to be dropped?" The pause that followed was different from the previous pauses she had observed in him. Those had been the pauses of a man thinking, choosing words. This one was different. The pause of something that cost something. "My nephew," he said at last. "He is 8 years old." He was in the room where the crown was displayed. It was kept in a glass case in the gallery at Aldenmuir Park, and he was, apparently, attempting to examine it more closely. The case was not adequately secured. Another pause. "He was not hurt." "I'm glad," Violet said. She meant it simply and did not add anything to it. The Duke set down his cup. "He was distraught. More than I thought appropriate, until I understood that he was afraid I would be angry with him, not about the crown, about the fact that he had touched something he had been told not to touch." "Were you angry?" He looked at her. The directness of the question seemed to arrive, she thought, not as an intrusion but as something unexpected. The experience of being asked directly by someone who was genuinely asking, not performing concern. "No," he said. "I was not angry with him. The crown was insured. He is 8. He picked up his cup again. "I told him so. I am not certain he believed me." Violet thought about this. She thought about the letter, the urgency of it, the doubled fee, the Venice contact, the detailed list of the crown's history prepared with such care. She thought about a man who had organized all of those things not for the value of the object, or not only for that, but for an 8-year-old boy who was afraid of having done an unforgivable thing. She looked at the Duke of Aldenmuir across her small consultation table and thought, "You are not what I expected at all." She did not say this. She said, "I'll write to him when it's finished, if you think it would help." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "He would like that enormously," he said, and something in his voice was entirely unguarded for one brief second before his composure reassembled itself. He left shortly after. At the door he paused. "The work," he said. "I did not expect it to be this. I had not understood the process. How careful it is." Violet tilted her head slightly. "That's what restoration is. You cannot rush it and get it right. The object sets the pace, not the restorer." He looked at her, and she had the sensation she had been having intermittently since they met, that he was reading something in her that she had not consciously offered. "I will let you work," he said. He left. The workshop settled back into its morning quiet, and Violet returned to the bent filigree branch, and the crown, and the careful, patient business of returning something broken to wholeness. He came again the following week, this time with advance notice. A brief note from Prescott, delivered the day before, saying only that His Grace would be passing through Bloomsbury on Thursday and would stop briefly if convenient. The phrase "if convenient" was, Violet thought, the kind of phrase that appeared in the correspondence of people who did not actually intend to be inconvenienced but wished to acknowledge that inconvenience was theoretically possible. She had the kettle ready. He arrived at 11, when Mrs. Colebrook was present, and the sight of a Duke standing in the Bloomsbury workshop caused Mrs. Colebrook to develop a sudden intense interest in reorganizing the supply cupboard at the far end of the room. Violet did not comment on this. She simply showed the Duke the progress. The 4 filigree branches were now fully repaired. Under magnification, the join lines were visible, hairline traces of the work. She would not pretend otherwise to him, she had decided and did not. But in ordinary light, in the room, held at the proper distance, the crown was already recognizable as itself again. The central setting had been reshaped, the splayed gold coaxed back to its original geometry. She was waiting for the sapphire from Bath, which was expected within the week. The Duke looked at the repaired crown for a long time without speaking. "The branch," he said at last. He was looking at the element that had been bent, the worst of the damage, the one she had spent the most time on. "I cannot see where it was." "You can, with a glass." She offered him her spare magnifier. He took it, bent close to the crown, and looked. She watched him rather than the crown, watched the stillness of his face as he looked, the quality of his attention. He found the join line. She saw the moment he found it, a fractional shift in his expression. "It's remarkable," he said quietly. Not as a compliment to her, she thought, but as a genuine observation about what he was seeing. The distinction mattered to her. The metal has a memory, she said. That sounds imprecise, but it's as close as I can come to describing it. When you work with it rather than against it, it tends back toward its original form. I found the right angle on the first day. The rest was patience. He straightened. How do you know the right angle? Violet thought about this. It was not a question she had been asked in quite this way before. I study the whole, she said. I look at the parts that haven't been damaged and understand their relationship to each other. Each element of the crown is in conversation with every other element. The angles of the leaves, the rhythm of the vine pattern, the proportion of solid gold to negative space. The damaged branch was telling me what it was supposed to be, by showing me what it couldn't currently do. It wanted to return. I just had to listen. The Duke looked at her with a quality of attention that she had begun to recognize and could not entirely categorize. It was not admiration, though there might have been admiration in it somewhere. It was more like the look of a person who has been surprised by something genuinely new and is still processing the surprise. You talk about objects as though they are alive, he said. Not alive, but not passive either. She set down her pencil. They carry the intention of the people who made them. That's not nothing. He looked at the crown again. No, he said slowly. It is not nothing. They had tea again. Mrs. Colebrook had, by this point, found reasons to be present in the main room, though she was facing the supply cupboard and maintaining the fiction of being occupied. Violet did not acknowledge this either. Tell me about the wedding crown tradition, Violet said. It was information she needed for the restoration. Understanding the object's use was part of understanding how to restore it, but she was also, she admitted to herself, simply curious. When did it begin? With the third Duke, he said. William Alden Mere. He was a diplomat. He spent 12 years in Florence and Venice in the service of the crown. He married a Venetian woman, Serafina Condulmer. The crown was her wedding gift, made for her by a Florentine goldsmith whose name we have not been able to recover. When they returned to England, she brought it with her. And she began the tradition? She specified it in her will, not as a requirement, as a wish. She wrote. He paused, and Violet had the impression that he was recalling something he had read rather than heard. He knew the details of this history the way one knows a thing that has been looked at many times. She wrote that the crown had been made for her wedding and should belong to all the weddings that came after it, that it was not a possession but a continuity. Violet was quiet for a moment. A continuity, she repeated. Yes. He looked at his cup. It has been worn by 11 brides. My grandmother was the last. And the next, Violet said carefully, will be. There is no next, he said. The words were not sharp, not closed off, but simply flat, carrying the particular weight of a fact that had been examined from every angle and accepted. I was married. My wife died 7 years ago. I do not intend to marry again. The silence that followed was the kind that asked nothing of her except to receive what had been said without filling it too quickly. I'm sorry, she said, after the right interval. Simply, without elaboration. She had learned that simple condolences, given without performance, were more honest than elaborate ones. Thank you. He picked up his cup again. The crown matters regardless. It represents something that should not be lost because of the particular circumstances of one generation. My nephew will one day be the Duke. When that time comes, he stopped. The crown will be ready, Violet said. He looked at her. In the morning light of her Bloomsbury workshop, with the crown in its rest between them and Mrs. Colebrook industriously reordering pencils she had already ordered, the Duke of Aldenmere looked at Violet Ashcroft with an expression that was not the controlled, assessing look of their first meeting. It was something quieter than that and something more open. The look of a man who has said something he did not intend to say in full, and found, to his considerable surprise, that saying it had cost him less than he expected. Yes, he said. That is precisely what I need. He left at noon. Mrs. Colebrook waited until she heard the front door close and then turned from the supply cupboard with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to remain professionally neutral. He came last week as well, she said. He did. Violet agreed. For the crown. For the crown. Mrs. Colebrook looked at the crown in its rest, then at Violet, then back at the crown. She said, in the particular way that meant she had formed an opinion and was choosing to keep it entirely to herself for now. Violet returned to her workbench and tried to concentrate on the central setting, and found that the morning had left a quality of disturbance in the air of the workshop that was not unpleasant precisely, but that she would need to think about when she was not pretending not to think about it. The sapphire arrived from Bath on a Wednesday morning, wrapped in tissue inside a small wooden box, accompanied by a certificate of authentication and a note from the dealer describing it as a Ceylonese white sapphire. Approximately late 17th century, color grade exceptional, clarity with one minor internal inclusion that would be fully concealed within the collet setting. Violet unwrapped it at her workbench under the magnifier and held it in the light. It was not a perfect match. There was no such thing as a perfect match across 2 centuries and 2 hemispheres. But it was as close as she had ever seen. The particular blue-white fire of old Ceylon sapphire, the subtle warm cast that modern stones had lost, the way it caught the light and held it rather than throwing it back. She wrote to Prescott that afternoon to report the stone's arrival. She also wrote a second letter, addressed not to Prescott but to the Duke directly. She was not sure when she had begun writing to him directly, rather than through the intermediary, but it had become the natural form of the correspondence, describing the stone and her assessment of its suitability. His reply came the next morning. The description is entirely satisfactory. I defer to your judgment on all matters of the commission, as I have from the beginning. Alden Mere, as I have from the beginning. She read the phrase twice. It was a small thing for words, but it settled somewhere in her chest with the particular warmth of something said without calculation. She set the letter in the correspondence folder she had begun keeping for this commission, which had grown, she noticed, somewhat larger than correspondence for other commissions. Then she put on her gloves and began the process of setting the sapphire. There are things that only proximity reveals. Not the proximity of a ballroom or a drawing room, where people navigate each other at the regulated distance that society prescribes, but the proximity of a shared occupation. 2 people attending to the same thing, from different angles, learning each other through the lens of what they both care about. By the 4th week of the commission, Violet had developed an understanding of the Duke of Alden Mere that she could not have anticipated. Not a complete understanding. She had come to think he was not a person who would ever be completely understood, in the way that certain very deep things were not completely understood but rather learned, but a working one. An understanding of the shape of him, the pattern of him, the way his mind worked when it was not working behind the armor of rank and restraint. He came to Bloomsbury 3 more times before the commission was finished. Each time with advance notice. Each time for what was ostensibly a progress review. Each time for what was actually something that had gradually and almost imperceptibly become a conversation. He asked questions that revealed the quality of his attention. Precise, specific, informed by what had been said in previous conversations rather than requiring her to repeat herself. He remembered that the gold of the crown was an unusual alloy and asked, during his 3rd visit, whether she had been able to identify the specific workshop origin. He had brought, without being asked, a reference volume on Florentine metalwork that he had sourced from a private library. She had not expected that. She had looked at him, when he placed the book on the table with the same offhand directness with which he did most things, no ceremony, no waiting for gratitude, and felt the distinct sensation of being genuinely surprised. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "A colleague has a library of Italian craftwork. I described what you had told me about the alloy composition and he thought this might be relevant." Violet opened the book. It was in Italian, which she read passably, and she found within 15 minutes a description of a Florentine goldsmith named Bartolomeo Farini, working in the 1680s and 90s, known for his use of a slightly reddened gold alloy achieved by the addition of a particular copper compound. The description of his filigree style matched the crown so precisely that she had to set the book down for a moment. She looked up. The Duke was watching her with that careful attention. "Bartolomeo Farini," she said. "You found him." "You found him," she corrected. "I just confirmed it." He looked down at the open book. Something moved in his expression. A quality of quiet pleasure, contained but real. The pleasure of a person who has solved part of a puzzle and is now watching the rest of it resolve. Violet realized, in that moment, that he had done this not because it was required or because it helped him in any way, but because he had been thinking about her work. While he was elsewhere, doing whatever Dukes did, he had thought about what she had said about the alloy, had pursued it, and had found someone who could help. She had spent a great deal of her life being the person who did things for others without being thought about in return. The reversal was so unexpected that she needed a moment before she trusted herself to respond normally. "It changes the restoration," she said, returning to the book. "If I know the workshop, I know his methods. There may be documentation of how he finished this kind of piece. The surface treatment in particular, I've been uncertain whether the slight matte quality of the gold is original or the result of age." "If it's original, then you preserve it," he said. "Yes. Rather than polishing it to what you thought it should look like." "Exactly." She looked at him. "That's the essential distinction in restoration. You restore to what it was, not to what it looks like it should be. The difference requires knowing what it actually was." He was quiet for a moment. "That principle applies to more than metalwork," he said. Violet tilted her head slightly. "It does. You are speaking about people. I'm speaking about objects," she said, holding his gaze with the calm steadiness that was her natural register. "Though you're welcome to extend the principle if it seems applicable." The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. There for a moment and then gone. It was the closest thing to unguarded she had seen from him in the workshop, and she noted it as she noted all evidence of the man beneath the composure. Carefully, and without making anything of it that he had not offered. On his fourth visit, the second week of April, the commission nearing its completion, he arrived to find her at a stage of work she had not expected him to see. She was sitting on a stool with the crown in its rest directly under the magnifier, her reading glasses on, her hair unpinned on one side where she had shoved it back impatiently, and she was speaking quietly to herself, the way she did when she was working through a difficult section. She heard him come in. She always heard him now, she had noticed, had developed a recognition of the particular quality of his arrival, and did not look up from the work. "The central setting," she said. "I'm setting the sapphire. Don't move quickly near the bench." He did not move at all. She was aware of him standing at the doorway, then moving very quietly to stand slightly behind her left shoulder, at the safe distance and simply watching. She set the sapphire. It was a process she had done hundreds of times, but never with this particular combination of factors. An 18th century collet that had been damaged and reformed, a stone selected for approximate rather than exact match, the need for perfect alignment within a filigree structure that had already been tested to its limit. She worked with a push tool no wider than a toothpick, applying pressure at quarter-millimeter intervals, checking the alignment after each movement, turning the crown in its rest, checking from every angle. When it was done, the stone seated, the collet closed, the setting secure, the blue-white fire of the sapphire visible through the gold prongs. She exhaled slowly and sat back. "There," she said. The Duke leaned forward slightly, looking at the crown, at the sapphire in its setting, surrounded by the restored filigree, the repaired branches, the pattern of leaves and vines intact and whole. "My God!" he said quietly. Not an exclamation. Something more private than that. Violet looked at the crown, and then at him, and saw on his face something she had not expected and would not have predicted. The expression of a man moved. Not overcome. He was not a man who was overcome, but genuinely moved. The guard dropped for one unselfconscious moment in the presence of something that mattered to him. She looked back at the crown to give him the privacy of the moment. "The pearls next week," she said. "Then the final surface treatment, and it's finished." "Yes." His voice had recovered its composure, but the quality of it was different, warmer. "Yes, I see." They had tea as they always did. Mrs. Colebrook had stopped pretending to be in the supply cupboard and simply sat at her own small desk, doing accounts with the focused energy of someone determined to be professionally present and personally absent. "I've been corresponding with your nephew," Violet said. "Thomas." "I know. He mentioned it." The Duke's expression did not change, but something in it softened. "He asked very good questions about the gold. how it was mined, what alloys were made, how craftsmen learned in that period. I sent him 3 pages. She paused. I hope that was. It was entirely appropriate. He set down his cup. He has been a different child since you wrote the first letter. Les waited. He carried it, didn't he? The dropping of the crown. Yes. A pause. Children carry things. More than they should be made to. There was a quality in his voice when he spoke of the boy, a quietness, not the careful neutrality of social performance, but the quietness of something that actually mattered. Violet had noticed it from his first mention of Thomas, and it had altered, incrementally, her picture of the man across the table from her. You were close with him, she said. Before the crown. I am close with him. The correction was gentle. He lives with me. His parents are, a pause, not in a position to care for him. He came to Aldenmere Park 3 years ago. He turned his cup slowly in his fingers. I did not know how to be what he needed. I still am not always certain I do. Violet listened. This was something she did well, not the active, nodding listening of someone signaling comprehension, but the actual, quiet listening of someone who understood that certain things needed to be said before they could be known, and that the person saying them sometimes needed only the space to say them. But you try, she said. I try. He looked at his cup. He is a remarkable boy. He sees things very clearly. He asked me once, when he had been with me perhaps 6 months, why I never laughed in the house. A pause, and something moved across his face that might have been humor or might have been something more complex. I didn't know what to say to him. What did you say? I told him that I had forgotten how. He looked up, and his gray eyes met hers directly. He looked at me with an expression I can still see perfectly, grave and entirely unsentimental. He said, I can teach you if you like. He was 6. Violet was very still. Did he? She asked. The Duke looked at her for a moment. Then, with the quality of something he had not done in a long time, and which surprised him, he smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, not the shadow of one. A real one. Brief, contained, but unmistakably genuine. And it changed his face entirely, the way sunlight through a cloud changes a landscape. He is working on it, he said. Violet looked at her teacup, and then out of the workshop window at the Bloomsbury Street beyond, and felt something settle in her chest that she was not immediately prepared to examine. Something warm and slightly unsteady, and more significant than she had space to consider in the middle of a workday. She turned back. The crown will be finished by Thursday week, she said, in the voice of a professional completing a sentence she had started. Good, he said, in the voice of a man who had just, for one unguarded moment, let her see something real, and was now carefully, not unkindly, returning to the normal terms of their arrangement. They finished their tea. He left. Mrs. Colebrook, from behind her accounts, said nothing for 30 seconds and then said, More tea, please, said Violet. The social world of London in the spring of 1887 moved with its usual combination of industry and pretense, and while Violet Ashcroft existed largely outside it, she had neither the income nor the appetite for the season, and her mother's anxious efforts to place her within it had reached the resigned stage of a campaign that both sides knew had been lost. She was not entirely unaware of it. She was aware, specifically, of the particular current that had begun moving through it in the 3rd week of April, when someone, she could not trace exactly who, but the origin appeared to be connected with Lady Sutherfield's Wednesday luncheons, began noting that the Duke of Aldenmere had been seen, on multiple occasions, visiting an address in Bloomsbury. She learned of this from her friend Clara Voss, who arrived at the workshop on a Saturday morning with 2 currant buns and the expression of someone delivering intelligence they found equal parts delicious and concerning. They are saying, Clara said, settling into the consultation chair with the ease of long familiarity, that he goes there every week, to Bloomsbury. She broke off a piece of currant bun. To see you. He comes to see the crown, Violet said. He comes to see the crown 6 times? Violet set down her file. 4 times. And yes. Violet. Clara's tone was affectionate and entirely frank. They had been friends since their shared school days in Bath, and Clara was the only person Violet knew who combined genuine warmth with a complete absence of sentimentality. You have a duke visiting your workshop once a week to watch you work on his crown and drink your tea. The tea is incidental. The tea is very much not incidental. Men like that. Clara waved her currant bun in the direction of a category that contained only the Duke of Aldenmere. They don't do things that are incidental. Violet looked at her workbench. He has been a considerate client. He found a reference volume that was genuinely useful to the restoration. He thinks about the work seriously. He thinks about you seriously. He thinks about the crown seriously, Violet said, with a calm she was not entirely certain she felt. It matters to his family. His nephew. His nephew is 8 years old and not the reason the Duke of Aldenmere has visited Bloomsbury 4 times. Clara ate her currant bun with the serene efficiency of someone who had made their point and was now simply waiting for it to land. Violet was quiet for a moment. There will be talk, she said. There is already talk, Clara said. There is always talk. The question is what you intend to do about it. A pause. Or not do about it. Violet looked at the crown in its rest, the sapphire in its setting, the pearls not yet placed, the final week of work ahead. She looked at the object that had brought an 8-year-old boy to her workshop by proxy and a grieving, armor-plated man to her consultation table in actuality, and felt the complex weight of both those things simultaneously. I intend to finish the crown, she said, properly, without rushing. Clara looked at her with the expression of someone who had known her for 20 years and was choosing to accept this answer while knowing perfectly well it was only part of one. All right, she said, and offered her the second currant bun. It was during the 5th week, the final week, that the complication arrived. Not a complication with the crown. The crown was, by that point, almost complete. The pearls set, the surface treatment applied with a soft burnishing that had brought up the subtle matte warmth of the original gold without obscuring the marks of age that were as much a part of the object's history as its craftsmanship. It sat in its rest on her workbench and was, Violet had decided that morning, as close to itself as it was possible for her to bring it. Not new. Not as it had looked the day Bartolomeo Farini finished it. But whole and recognizable, and wearing its history with dignity. The complication arrived in the form of her father. Sir Edmund Ashcroft appeared at the workshop at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, which was so far outside the bounds of his usual behavior that Violet's first response was alarm. Something must have happened. He was not an ill man, but he was not a well one, and the look on his face when she opened the door was enough to shift the alarm from physical to something else. He sat down in the consultation chair without being invited, which also was not like him. Sir Edmund was a man who waited to be asked even in his own house. I have had a letter, he said. Violet sat across from him, her hands in her lap, her attention steady. From a solicitor representing a firm of creditors, Sir Edmund continued, looking at the window rather than at her. The final accounting has been, it is more than I had understood. There are several properties that must be released. A pause. Including this one. Violet was very still. The lease, she said. The creditors have the right to recall it. I had used it as... He stopped. He was not, she saw now, an unfeeling man. He was a man who had never learned how to feel things in front of others, and who was now being required to do precisely that. I am sorry, Violet. I know what this workshop is to you. She looked at the room around her. The shelves of tools and materials. The 3 commission boxes on the side table, the morning light, the smell of linseed and thyme. How long? She said. 6 weeks. Possibly 8, if the solicitor can arrange a delay. He looked at her now, with the painful directness of someone who has run out of ways to avoid a face. I am sorry. I know, she said. She did know. Blame required energy she did not have, and the habit of resentment was one she had not cultivated. What she felt instead was something colder and more practical. The calculation of what 6 weeks meant, what 8 weeks could do, what the options were. She saw him out and stood in the empty workshop and did not allow herself to feel the full weight of it yet, because there was still the crown. She returned to her workbench. She sat down. She picked up the crown. Right, she said. Let's get you finished. She wrote to the Duke that evening. Not to Prescott, to the Duke. She wrote it twice, discarding the first draft because it was too carefully calibrated, and wrote the second with the directness she had practiced all her life. Your Grace, the crown is nearly finished. I expect to complete the final work by Thursday and would ask that you arrange for collection on Friday morning, or any time that day at your convenience. I will have a full written account of the restoration ready to accompany it, including the Farini identification and all material notes. I also wish to inform you, so that you are not left without notice, that I will need to relocate the workshop within the next 2 months. This will not affect any current commission. I mention it only so that you are aware, in the event of future correspondence. She sent it. She did not elaborate on the reason for the relocation. That was not his concern. His reply came the following morning in the early post. She recognized the handwriting before she opened it. Miss Ashcroft, Friday collection is arranged. I am grateful for the full account. It will be an important addition to the family records. As for the relocation, I hope the circumstances prompting it are not serious. If there is any assistance I can render, practical, not offered as charity, but as the act of someone who has benefited considerably from your particular skill and wishes that skill to continue to be available to people who need it, please say so directly. I have several properties in various stages of usefulness, and a nephew who has just written to inform me that he intends to become a goldsmith when he grows up. Alden Mere. Violet sat with the letter in her hands for a longer time than she would have admitted. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in the correspondence folder, and went to finish the crown. The crown was finished on a Thursday. Not finished in the provisional, more or less sense that some restorations ended finished, complete, done. Violet knew the feeling. It was not pride exactly, though it contained that. It was something more like recognition. The crown was itself again. The work between herself and the object was resolved. She placed it in the fitted case she had prepared. A new case, lined with ivory silk, with recessed supports for the crown that would keep it stable during transport, and set it on her workbench and looked at it for a long time. 230 years. 11 brides. One Venetian woman who had wanted it to be not a possession but a continuity. One 8-year-old boy who had dropped it from 4 feet onto marble and been terrified of the consequence. And now here. She wrote the full restoration account that evening. 22 pages, including material analysis, historical notes on Farini and his workshop, a full photographic record she had made at each stage of the work, and a separate section on the sourcing and selection of the replacement sapphire and pearls. She had always written full accounts for significant commissions. This one she wrote with particular care, as though she were writing something that would last, because she understood now that it would. Friday morning came with the pale, clear quality of a late April day that had decided to be genuinely spring. Violet was at her bench at 8 o'clock, the crown in its case, the account in its folder, the workshop in the particular state of order that she always imposed at the end of a significant commission. Everything in its place, every surface clean, every tool returned, as though the room were composing itself after something important. At 9 o'clock the knock came. She had expected Prescott. Prescott with his leather folder and his brisk professional manner, collecting the case with efficiency and conveying her regards to his grace. The Duke of Aldenmere stood at her door. He was alone. No footman, no carriage visible in the street behind him. He wore a plain dark coat and no hat, and the morning light found the lines of his face and the silver threads at his temples, and he looked, standing on her Bloomsbury doorstep, like a man who had decided to come himself and was now discovering that the simplicity of that decision had carried him further than he had quite prepared for. "Your Grace," Violet said. "I thought," he stopped, began again. "I wanted to see it finished. In context. Before it goes back to the case it's been in for years." A pause. "If that is appropriate." "Of course," Violet said and stepped back from the door. He came in. Mrs. Colebrook was not yet arrived, which left the workshop with its morning quiet, just the two of them and the crown. He stood at the bench and looked at it in the case, and she watched him look at it, and the room was very still. She lifted the crown from the case and held it in both gloved hands, turning it in the light the way she had done on the first morning she had examined it. "Come around to this side," she said. "The light is better." He came to stand beside her, close beside her the way the bench required, so that they were both looking at the crown in the same light, the same angle of morning. She turned it slowly. The sapphire caught the light and threw it back in that particular way. Not the brilliant scatter of a modern stone, but a deeper, warmer fire, the accumulated intensity of 2 centuries of being something precious. The filigree moved through the light like a pattern of shadows and gold. The pearls gleamed, the repaired branches indistinguishable to the eye from the originals, the whole object coherent and whole in itself. The Duke did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was quiet and entirely without performance. She would be satisfied, he said. Serafina, if she knew. Violet understood that he was not speaking generally. He meant something specific, that the woman who had wanted the crown to be a continuity, who had specified in her will that it should belong to all the weddings that came after hers, would look at this, the restored crown, the sapphire that was not the original sapphire, the pearls that were not the original pearls, the gold that had been worked by hands that were not Farini's, and would understand that the intention had been kept, that the form had been preserved so that the meaning could continue. Yes, Violet said. I think she would. He stood very still. She was aware of the warmth of him beside her, the closeness that the bench required, his shoulder nearly touching hers. She was aware that she had been aware of this in a specific way for the last several weeks, and that this morning, for reasons she did not examine, she was more aware of it than she had been. Miss Ashcroft, he said. He did not use a different register than usual. He used the same careful, measured voice. But there was something in it that was not the same. Violet, she said quietly, before she had quite decided to say it. He was silent for a moment. Violet. The word in his voice had a quality she had not heard before. Not the quality of a name being used for the first time, but the quality of a name being settled, placed carefully in a new position. I would like, he said and stopped. He was a man who chose words with precision and did not begin sentences he could not complete, and this stop was therefore significant. He began again. I would like to discuss the matter you mentioned in your letter. The workshop. That is not a concern for your grace. I think it is. He turned his head and looked at her directly, with the gray-eyed directness she had learned by now was the particular form his honesty took. Not as a patron, not as the owner of properties who happens to have a vacant studio available. As, he stopped again. The second stop. Violet held the crown in both hands and looked at him steadily and waited, with the full patience of someone who had learned to let difficult things arrive at their own pace. I have been looking for a reason, he said at last. To continue these visits after the commission ended. That is the truth of it. I could dress it in practicality, in concern for the welfare of a useful professional, but those would be the faintest compression of his mouth, something that was not quite self-deprecation but was near it, not entirely honest. Violet was quiet. You have been... I had not expected... He stopped for the third time. He was, she realized, not a man who struggled to speak. He was a man who was struggling to speak this particular thing, which was a different matter entirely. I had not expected to find in this arrangement something that I did not wish to lose when it ended. He was looking at the crown. The arrangement, he said, of the commission, not. And here he turned his head and looked at her with an expression that was so entirely unguarded that Violet felt it land somewhere deep and quiet in her chest. Not only the commission. Violet looked at him. At the man who had arrived at her Bloomsbury doorstep with no footman and no hat, and the look of someone who had decided to do something and was discovering in the doing of it how much it cost him. At the man who had brought her a book from a private library and found a craftsman dead for 2 centuries and made sure an 8-year-old boy had someone to write to. She placed the crown carefully back in its case. I would like to say something, she said, that I am going to say plainly because I find that I have spent considerable effort on other people's complications and not quite enough on my own. He looked at her. I have looked forward to Thursdays, she said. For the last 4 weeks, I have looked forward to Thursdays in a way that has nothing to do with the commission. That is also the truth of it. The silence that followed was not the careful managed silence of their early acquaintance. It was the silence of 2 people who have both said something real and are simply letting it exist. Then, he said, and she heard in his voice something she had not heard there before. Not warmth exactly, but the possibility of warmth, the crack in the wall through which light comes. I would very much like to find a reason to continue the Thursdays. Violet thought about what Clara had said. Men like that don't do things that are incidental. She thought about a letter that said I have from the beginning. She thought about a smile, real, brief, transforming, given over an account of a 6-year-old boy who offered to teach a man how to laugh. I think, she said, that could be arranged. He looked at her then with an expression she could not have described to anyone who had not spent 5 weeks learning to read the face of a man who had spent years forgetting how to be read. It was not joy. It was something quieter than joy and more durable, the expression of a person who has been afraid of wanting something and has found that wanting it did not, in the end, destroy him. I should like, he said carefully, to take you to see Aldenmere Park, when you are at liberty. It has a gallery where the crown will be displayed, and there are other things there that I think you would like to see. He was not talking about the gallery. When I've finished the Cavendish snuff-box, she said. He looked at her. The ghost of his smile, the real one, was present in his eyes before it reached his mouth. How long? A week, she said. Possibly less, if the lid cooperates. Then I'll write to you, he said. On Friday. She nodded. He collected the case with the crown and the folder with the restoration account and walked to the door. Violet, he said at the threshold. She looked at him. Thank you, he said, for all of it. She held his gaze. Right on Friday, she said. He left. Violet stood in the center of her workshop in the morning light, without the crown, without the weight of the commission, and felt something that she took a moment to identify properly because it was not a feeling she had extensive practice with. She felt simply and entirely seen. The letter arrived on Friday, as he had said. Violet had been at the bench all morning, the Cavendish snuff-box lid open before her, and the letter arrived in the second post at 2 o'clock. She recognized the hand on the envelope immediately, that bold, angular slant, and set it beside her tools and did not open it until she had reached a natural stopping place in the work, because some things deserve to be opened at the right moment. She opened it at the small consultation table with a cup of tea, the workshop quiet around her. Violet, I have been thinking about what you said about restoration, that you restore to what the thing was, not to what it looks like it should be, that the object carries the intention of the people who made it. I find I have been thinking about this in a context that has nothing to do with metalwork. I have spent 7 years, I think, trying to restore myself to something I thought I was supposed to be. Contained, efficient, self-sufficient. The kind of man who manages everything alone because he has decided that wanting assistance or company or continuity is a weakness that costs too much. I am not certain when I decided otherwise. I am fairly certain, however, when I began to. I would like to take you to Aldenmere Park, not only to show you the gallery. I would like you to meet Thomas properly, not by letter. He has asked after you with a persistence that suggests he has inherited a characteristic I recognize. I have a question to ask you there, in the proper setting, with more ceremony than I generally permit myself. I think the occasion merits ceremony. Friday the 29th, if you are at liberty. I will send the carriage at 10. James. Not Aldenmere. Not even a full name. Just James. Violet read the letter twice, as she had read the first one, standing in the hall of the Ashcroft townhouse. Then she set it down and looked out the workshop window at the Bloomsbury Street, at the ordinary Friday afternoon traffic and the plane tree in its new spring leaves, and felt something open in her chest like a window thrown wide in the first warm weather. Mrs. Colebrook arrived at that moment, shaking rain off her umbrella. She looked at Violet. She looked at the letter on the table. She said nothing for a moment. More tea? She asked. Please, Violet said. And Mrs. Colebrook. I believe the snuff-box lid can wait until Monday. Mrs. Colebrook made the tea. She set it down. She said with great care and complete sincerity, Good. There were, in the week that followed, complications of the kind that Violet had anticipated and had already decided, in the small hours of a Wednesday night, were not going to move her. They came from the direction she expected, her mother. Lady Constance Ashcroft had heard, the machinery of London social intelligence being what it was, a version of what was happening that was accurate in outline and somewhat embroidered in detail. She arrived at the workshop on Monday, which was itself an act of such unprecedented maternal engagement that Violet was briefly disarmed before she remembered why she had learned not to be disarmed. "The Duke of Aldenmere," Lady Constance said, sitting in the consultation chair with her bag in her lap and her back as straight as the workshop's informal atmosphere permitted. "You have seen him 6 times. For a commission that required 6 progress reviews, yes. And he has written to you. Clients write to me regularly. It is how commissions are managed." Lady Constance regarded her youngest daughter with an expression that was less calculating than usual and more something else. Something that might, in a less guarded woman, have been anxiety. "Violet, I am not a fool, and I would prefer that you not manage me the way you manage everyone else." Violet set down her file. This was fair. She looked at her mother directly. "He's invited me to Aldenmere Park," she said. "He has a question he wishes to ask me there." A silence. "And you intend to go?" Lady Constance said. "Yes." Another silence. Her mother looked at her hands, which were in her lap with unusual stillness. "I have not always," she began and stopped. "I know that you have not had, that the consideration given to your situation has not always been." She stopped again. Violet looked at her mother with the patience of someone who had waited a very long time for a particular sentence and was willing to wait a little longer. "I know," Lady Constance said finally simply, "that you have managed a great deal for a long time without being asked. I want you to know that I know." It was not an apology. It was not a full reckoning. But it was real, and offered with an honesty that her mother did not come to easily, and Violet received it as what it was. "Thank you," she said. "That matters." Lady Constance nodded. She picked up her bag. She stood. At the door, she paused in the way that people paused in doorways when they had something further and were not certain how to say it. "He is a serious man," she said. "Yes," Violet agreed. "Good," said Lady Constance, with the decisive finality of someone who had assessed a situation and found the result acceptable and left. Violet sat for a moment in the quiet after her mother's departure, and felt the particular quality of a thing settled. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to build on. There was one further complication, and it came from a direction she had not anticipated. The Friday before the Aldenmere Park visit, Violet encountered a woman named Mrs. Harriet Grantley at a print dealer's on the Strand, where they were both examining an exhibition of Venetian architectural engravings. Mrs. Grantley was the kind of woman who moved through London society with the ease of someone who had never needed to earn anything and had therefore never learned to value what things actually cost. She was pleasant in conversation, which made what she said worse. "Miss Ashcroft." The warmth was entirely genuine, which was its own kind of difficulty. "I have been meaning to speak with you. I heard the most charming thing, that you have been doing work for Aldenmere. How fascinating." Violet looked at a Venetian engraving. "I have had a commission from Aldenmere House, yes. The Crown Restoration. Everyone knows. It has been the most talked about thing." Mrs. Grantley moved closer, lowering her voice to the register of intimate confidence. "I do want to say, as a friend, and I hope you will receive this as friendship, that people are saying, well, they are saying various things about the visits, about the letters, about... I want to say that I think it is very wise to be careful." Violet turned from the engraving. "Careful of what, Mrs. Grantley?" The woman's expression was warm, sympathetic, and carrying beneath the warmth the sharp edge of a conclusion already reached. "He is a very eligible man," she said, with the care of someone placing each word precisely. "And you are, I mean this kindly, my dear, not the kind of match that people would expect for Aldenmere. The disparity of situation." She paused. "I only say this so that you understand the view from outside. People will talk. Some will be unkind. I should not like to see you hurt." Violet looked at Mrs. Grantley, at the warm face and the kind eyes and the very comfortable certainty of someone who had never needed to be anything other than exactly what she was expected to be. "Thank you, Mrs. Grantley," she said. "That's very considerate." She turned back to the Venetian engraving. "I find, however, that I have spent a great deal of my life being careful about things on behalf of other people's comfort. I've recently decided to be somewhat less careful." Mrs. Grantley blinked. I hope you enjoy the exhibition, Violet said, pleasantly, and moved to the next engraving. She stood before a view of the Grand Canal and felt, beneath the careful composure she had worn all her life, the particular quiet satisfaction of a decision that had been made at its proper time. She was going to Aldermere Park on Friday the 29th. She was going to meet an 8-year-old boy who wanted to be a goldsmith and had already written her 7 letters full of intelligent questions. She was going to walk in the grounds of a house she had never seen with a man who had said "I have" from the beginning and who had smiled, really smiled, over a story about a child offering to teach him how to laugh. And whatever Mrs. Grantley and the rest of London said about it, they could say it without her assistance. Aldermere Park was in Hampshire, 2 hours from London on a clear morning when the roads were kind and the driver knew the way. Violet had looked out the carriage window for the full journey, not from restlessness but from the particular attention she brought to things she wanted to understand properly. The countryside in late April had the saturated quality of land that had been persuaded back to color after winter, the hedgerows in new leaf, the fields breaking green against the pale sky, the farms set back from the road with their particular settled stillness. She had brought her work bag, out of habit, and her notebook and a letter from Thomas, his 8th, that had arrived that morning and that she had read in the carriage and smiled at. He had asked her, with the direct logical precision that she had come to recognize as characteristic, whether it was possible to repair a crown that had been broken into very many pieces, or whether at a certain point of brokenness the repair was no longer possible and one had to begin again. She had written back in the margin, for handing to him when she arrived, "It depends on what's been lost. If the pieces are present, the repair is always possible. The craft is in the knowing of where each piece belongs." The gate came into view, wrought iron, old, set between stone pillars with a heraldic device Violet recognized as the Aldermere Falcon, and the drive beyond it was lined with beech trees not yet in full canopy, their leaves the particular translucent green of spring, light coming through them in patterns that moved. She had expected the house to be severe. The Duke's London townhouse was composed, impeccable, defended. She had adjusted that expectation somewhat after his description of Thornfield. No, she corrected herself, that was the other story. After his description of what the house meant to his family. But even adjusted, she had not quite prepared herself for what Aldermere Park actually was. It was old. Not the aggressive oldness of a house that wanted you to know its importance, but the deep, settled oldness of a building that had been lived in continuously for 300 years and carried that living in every stone. It was built of a warm, honey-colored limestone that the morning light caught and held. The wings were irregular, added by different generations at different times, which gave the facade a quality of accumulated personality rather than designed impression. There were roses along the south wall, old roses, not yet in bloom, their canes thick with decades of growth. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. Violet descended, looked up at the house, and thought, yes, this is where the crown belongs. James Montford, the Duke of Aldermere, was standing at the top of the entrance steps. Beside him, slightly forward in the way of a child who is very eager but has been reminded about decorum, was a boy of approximately 8 years old with dark hair and a face that carried a distinct family resemblance and was currently expressive in a way that the Duke's almost never was. Thomas. She had known him for 2 months by letter and had formed a clear picture of him from those letters. The picture was accurate, she found, though insufficient. It had not captured the quality of energy he carried, the way his whole face was engaged in something he hadn't yet spoken, the fact that he had clearly been waiting at the top of those steps for some time. "Miss Ashcroft," James said. His voice was as measured as always, but his eyes, when they met hers, held something she recognized now. The warmth he had stopped hiding from her. "Your Grace," she said. And then, because he was vibrating with contained urgency, "Thomas." "Hello," said Thomas Montford, with the directness of someone who had decided that formalities were a delay. "Did you read my letter?" "I did. I wrote you back." She opened her bag and produced the notebook with the margin note. "I thought it might travel faster this way." Thomas took it. "Read it." His expression underwent a complex transition that Violet watched with interest. From question to answer to the particular satisfaction of an answer that had confirmed something he had already partly believed. "So if all the pieces are there," he said, It can always be fixed. With enough patience and the right tools, yes. He looked at her. He was 8, and he had the eyes of someone considerably older in specific respects, a quality of observation that she suspected he had inherited from the man standing quietly behind him. "Uncle James has those," he said. "Patience and tools." James looked at the sky with an expression of composed neutrality that was, Violet understood by now, his version of being very nearly amused. "Shall we go in?" he said. The house was everything its exterior had suggested. Not a showplace, but a home. The kind of home that has been used, loved, adapted over generations, with the particular character of a place that has absorbed the lives of many people and kept a quality of all of them. The library was full of actual books. The morning room had a window seat with a faded cushion that showed years of being sat in. The gallery, when James showed her to it, had the light she had imagined. Long windows on the east wall, pale and honest, the kind of light that showed objects exactly as they were. The crown's case was in the gallery. They stood before it. James, Violet, Thomas, and James opened it. Thomas had been in the room when the crown fell. He had not seen it since, and Violet watched his face as he looked at it now, whole, the sapphire in its setting, the filigree complete. "It's the same," he said. But the tone of it was not the tone of someone disappointed by sameness. It was the tone of someone who had feared that sameness was not possible, and had been given it back. "Yes," Violet said. "That's what restoration means. Same even after." He looked at her with the gray eyes he had inherited. "Thank you," he said, 8 years old, and entirely sincere. She felt the weight of the 2 words and received them properly. "You're welcome," she said. James placed the crown in the fitted display mount he had prepared for it, a mount that held it at eye level, catching the gallery light visible from every angle. Then he closed the display case with a quiet click that had in it the quality of a door finally closed after a long time open. Thomas was dispatched to his lessons by a tutor who appeared in the gallery doorway with the look of someone accustomed to fetching him from improbable locations. He went without complaint, which Violet suspected was unusual, pausing at the door to look back once at the crown and once at her. "You'll still be here at tea?" he asked her. "I'll still be here at tea," she said. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and went. The gallery was quiet. The morning light lay in long rectangles across the wooden floor. Violet stood before the display case and felt the particular completion of the commission. The crown in its proper place, in the house it belonged to, in the light it had been made to be seen in. James stood beside her. She was aware, as she was always aware now, of the quality of his presence. The warmth of him, the steady solidity, the particular rightness of it. "I said in my letter," he began, "that I had a question to ask you, in the proper setting." "You did," she said. "I have spent rather a long time," he said, "managing things by myself, including, I think, the way I feel about the things that matter to me. The work, Thomas, this house." He paused. "You." Violet looked at the crown in its case, the sapphire catching the light. "I am not a man who finds these things," he stopped. "The old difficulty. The particular difficulty of this particular thing. I am better than I was," he said, with a dry self-awareness that was entirely honest. 3 months ago I would not have been able to." He stopped again. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said quietly. "I want to marry you," he said. Not decorated, not constructed. Simply said, in the direct way he said things that were true. "I want you in this house. I want Thursday mornings in the workshop and arguments about alloy compositions and letters from Thomas addressed to both of us. I want." He turned to look at her fully, with the gray eyes that she had learned to read, and in them she saw the thing she had been watching since the first visit to her bench, the warmth that had never quite gone away, even when the composure had covered it. "I want to know what you see when you look at a broken thing, and I want to understand it properly, from the inside. I want to keep." He stopped. He looked at her with something that was not the composed Duke of Aldenmere, and not the careful man who had sat at her consultation table with both hands around a teacup. Something that was simply James. "I want to keep being known by you," he said. "That is the simplest way I can say it." Violet stood in the gallery of Aldenmuir Park and felt the full weight of the moment. The crown behind her in its case, the light through the tall windows, the house around them with its 300 years of lives, and the man in front of her with his 7 years of learning to live again and his 8-year-old nephew and his falcon seal and his book from a private library and his letters that said I have from the beginning. She reached into her work bag and produced the letter Thomas had given back to her in the entrance hall, the margin note she had written. If the pieces are present, the repair is always possible. She held it out to him. He took it, read it, looked at her. Yes, she said, simply, completely, without qualification. The same word he had given her in her workshop at the beginning of all of it. Yes, I want that too. James looked at her for a long, still moment, and then he took her hands, both of them, the way she had imagined from the letter, from the words I want to keep being known by you, and held them in his with a warmth and firmness that felt, as she had once said about the gold alloy of the crown, like something that had been waiting to return to its proper form. He did not say anything more for a moment. He simply held her hands and looked at her with the expression that had been building since the morning he stood in her doorway with no hat and no footman, and the look of someone who had decided to do something irrevocable, and was only now understanding how glad he was. There is something else, he said after a moment. She waited. The crown, he said. He glanced back toward the display case. Seraphina's instruction, that it should belong to all the weddings that came after. 11 brides have worn it. He paused, and she heard in the pause all the weight of the years between the 11th and now, the year the crown had stayed in its case, the marriage that had ended, the grief that had settled into discipline because discipline was the only container large enough. I had thought, he said quietly, that it would perhaps skip a generation, that it would wait for Thomas. Violet looked at him, at the careful composure and the open eyes and the man she had learned over 5 weeks and the rest of her life would continue learning. James, she said. He looked at her. It waited for us, she said. Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, not the shattering of something weak, but the opening of something that had been closed for a very long time, the way a window opens onto air that has been held out for too long, and the quality of that opening was so entirely genuine that Violet felt it land in her chest and stay there. He lifted one of her hands and pressed it to his lips, and the gesture was not the formal kiss of protocol but something entirely different. Something slow and deliberate and weighted with what it meant, offered by a man who was choosing it fully. I believe, he said, his voice entirely steady and entirely warm, that tea is at 4 o'clock. And Thomas will be there, Violet said. Thomas will absolutely be there. He has been asking since Tuesday whether he may show you the estate workshop. There is a lathe he is very proud of. Violet laughed, and the sound of it in the gallery was real and clear, and she watched it reach him, watched the way it arrived in his eyes and settled, watched him receive it with the particular quality of a man who has been given something he had not known he was waiting for. Then, she said, we should probably make use of the morning. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked together along the gallery, past the paintings of previous generations, past the windows that gave onto the grounds, and through the door at the far end that led into the house itself. The house that was warm and old and had been waiting in its own way for exactly this. 3 years later. Aldenmuir Park, October. The crown sat in its gallery case, the morning light finding the sapphire and the repaired filigree and the pearls with the same quality it had found on the first day Violet had placed it there. Beside the display case was a framed document, the restoration account, 22 pages, the history of Bartolomeo Farini and the Florentine workshop and the replacement sapphire from Bath and the Baroque pearls from Venice. Violet had framed it herself, the summer after the wedding, because it was part of the crown's story now and the story deserved to be told in full. She was in the workshop when James found her, which was where he usually found her in the mornings. Not her Bloomsbury workshop, that had been a grief, the loss of it, but a manageable one, because what had come after had included the long stone outbuilding behind the east wing that had been empty for 40 years and had been, with Thomas's enthusiastic assistance, converted into something considerably better than what she had lost. Better light, better space, room for Thomas's lathe, which occupied the far end under a window, and which Thomas used with increasing skill and decreasing supervision. Room for the 3 commissions currently in progress. Room for the cats that had arrived sequentially without anyone quite deciding to acquire them. James stood in the doorway of the workshop in the way she recognized. The way that meant he was there to be with her for a few minutes rather than to ask anything. He had learned this from her, she thought, the practice of simply being present in a space where someone you loved was doing something they loved, without demanding their attention. He had taken to it with the same thorough dedication he brought to everything important. "Thomas is asking," he said, "whether you will come to look at the saddle fittings when you have a natural stopping place. He believes the stitching on the nearside girth strap is failing and wants your assessment before he goes to the saddler. Tell him 20 minutes. James came into the workshop and stood at the edge of the bench, looking at the current commission. A damaged enamel snuff box, French, early 19th century, a repair she had been looking forward to since it arrived. He looked at it the way he had learned to look at things in her workshop. Carefully, without touching, with the attention that was one of the things she loved most about him. "Well?" she said. "The enamel on the left hinge," he said. "It looks like the break is running along the original join rather than through the material." She looked. He was right. "You've been doing your reading again. I found a monograph on Limoges work in the library last week. I think it was your grandmother's." "It was." She set down the magnifier. "You're going to end up being my most knowledgeable assistant." "I shall endeavor to remain useful," he said, with the dry delivery that she had come to understand was his most fluent form of humor. She looked at him, this man who had brought the crown to her and the boy and the library and the October morning and the light through the workshop windows and all of it, all the accumulated ordinary particular days of a life that was, she thought, exactly what it was supposed to be. "You are considerably more than useful," she said. He looked at her with gray eyes that were warm, unguarded, entirely his. "So are you," he said quietly, "as you may be coming to believe." Violet turned back to the enamel snuff box. She thought about a woman named Seraphina, who had wanted a crown to be not a possession but a continuity. She thought about the year she had worn it, at the Aldenmere Chapel, in October rain, with Thomas at the front of the church looking both solemn and desperate to grin. She thought about repair and restoration and the difference between the two. About pieces that could always be brought back if you knew where they belonged. About the object that carries the intention of the person who made it. About the work, patient and careful, of returning something broken to wholeness. 20 minutes, she said. "I'll tell Thomas," he said, and left her to the work, which was what she had always needed, and which was now, entirely and wonderfully, hers. In the gallery at Aldenmere Park, the crown caught the morning light. The sapphire, not the original stone, but its closest match across 200 years, gathered the October sun and held it. The filigree branches, all 4 of them, curved as Bartolomeo Farini had intended them to curve in a Florentine workshop 330 years ago. The pearls gleamed. The gold, that reddish Florentine gold with its particular memory, wore its repair lines under the surface, invisible to any eye that did not know exactly where to look. A continuity, as Seraphina had wished, as it had always been and would be again. If this story found its way to your heart, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Every story begins here, and every time you share it, it reaches a little further.